The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension as the proceedings began. The defendant, a sharply dressed man in his 30s, with a perfectly tailored suit and tie, sat rigidly in his chair. His face was a canvas of anxiety and determination, beads of sweat forming along his brow as he tried to maintain his composure. Across the room, the prosecutor, a man in his 40s, with an air of unyielding authority, stared him down. The prosecutor's piercing eyes and measured tone left no doubt about his intent. He was here to dismantle the defendant's credibility piece by piece. As the judge called the court to order, whispers among the spectators filled the room like a restless undercurrent. The defendant's hands trembled slightly as he clutched his folder, the weight of the situation clearly visible in every gesture. The prosecutor wasted no time, launching into a series of pointed, almost personal questions that cut deep into the defendant's character. Every word seemed designed to shake his confidence. In that charged moment, every sound from the echoing footsteps of bailiffs to the soft rustle of papers heightened the intensity of the scene. As the prosecutor's relentless questioning continued, the defendant's anxiety transformed into palpable anger. With each probing question, his responses became sharper, more agitated. Finally, unable to contain the building frustration, the defendant slammed his hand down on the polished table. The resounding impact reverberated throughout the courtroom, drawing startled gasps and murmurs from the onlookers. "Enough!" the defendant shouted, his voice trembling between rage and despair. "I'm not some criminal you can just hound with accusations." His face flushed a deep crimson, and his eyes shone with a mix of defiance and anguish. For a brief moment, the courtroom fell into stunned silence, only the sound of his pounding hand and the scrape of his chair breaking the stillness. The prosecutor's lips curled into a slight, almost smug smile. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he replied coolly, "Mr. Johnson, your outburst only confirms that you have something to hide." His tone, measured and precise, sent a chill down the spines of everyone present. Even the judge's stern gaze bore the weight of disappointment, silently urging both sides to regain control. Just as the courtroom seemed ready to erupt into chaos, the prosecutor executed an unexpected maneuver. With a deliberate calmness, he produced a thick envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the defendant's desk. The envelope contained a document that had never been mentioned before, one that could unravel the defendant's carefully constructed story. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor announced, his voice resonating with authority, "I present to you evidence that calls into question every word Mr. Johnson has uttered." As he slid the document across the table, the defendant's eyes darted over the contents, his confident facade beginning to crumble. A look of sheer disbelief washed over his face, as if he were suddenly staring at an enemy he never anticipated. The tension in the room multiplied. Spectators leaned forward, eager to catch a glimpse of the document. The defendant's hands shook uncontrollably as he reached for it. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted from heated anger to stunned silence, the kind that speaks volumes without a single word being exchanged. The shockwave from the revelation hit the courtroom like a tidal wave. Unable to bear the weight of the new evidence, the defendant's composure shattered completely. Rising from his seat, he began a tirade that filled the room with raw emotion. "You call this evidence?" he bellowed, voice echoing off the high walls. "This is a travesty. You've twisted my words and my actions into something unrecognizable." His hands flailed wildly, and his eyes searched desperately for any sign of mercy from the judge, who sat stoically behind his bench. The prosecutor, unfazed, countered with icy precision. "Mr. Johnson, facts do not bend to your outbursts," he declared. His words, coupled with the weight of the document, sent ripples of discontent through the gathered crowd. The judge's gavel remained silent for several long seconds as he contemplated the escalating chaos. The tension was now a tangible force, binding everyone in a moment of collective uncertainty. Amidst the turbulent exchange, the defendant suddenly shifted his strategy. Lowering his voice to a near whisper, he confessed to having formed a covert alliance with an unexpected party, a move that would upend the prosecutor's narrative entirely. "I've worked with someone on the inside," he admitted, his voice trembling with a mix of regret and determination. "I trusted them to help me clear my name." The confession rippled through the room like wildfire, casting a murmur of shock and disbelief among the spectators. Eyes darted between the defendant and the prosecutor, trying to grasp the magnitude of the revelation. The prosecutor's face tightened, his eyes narrowing as he struggled to process this new twist. An alliance, He questioned sharply. "And who exactly is this person, Mr. Johnson? What have you done?" The defendant's silence in response only deepened the mystery, leaving the courtroom suspended in an uneasy balance between accusation and reluctant curiosity. The judge, caught off guard by this confession, leaned forward, his interest piqued even as he maintained his authority. Not willing to let the defendant's confession derail his case, the prosecutor swiftly mounted a counteroffensive. Retrieving a previously hidden file from his briefcase, he laid out new evidence that directly contradicted the defendant's account of the alliance. With steely precision, he began to dismantle the defendant's claims, word by word, fact by fact. "Let's review the timeline," the prosecutor said, his voice measured yet piercing. He pointed to a series of documents that clearly showed inconsistencies in the defendant's story. "The evidence in this file indicates that any so-called alliance you refer to was nothing more than a misunderstanding," he continued, his tone leaving no room for doubt. The defendant's eyes darted around the room, his earlier defiance now replaced by a dawning realization of the trap he then wittingly set for himself. Spectators exchanged uneasy glances as the new evidence was meticulously detailed on a projector screen. The prosecutor's counterattack not only undermined the defendant's narrative but also cast a shadow of doubt over his entire credibility. Every word, every slide, was a calculated move designed to strip away any remaining hope the defendant might have clung to. The rising tension between the defendant and the prosecutor had reached a boiling point. Sensing that the chaos might soon spiral out of control, the judge rose from his seat. His voice, deep and resolute, cut through the clamor, demanding order. "Enough," he declared, slamming his gavel with such force that the sound reverberated against the courtroom walls. The sudden outburst silenced every whisper and halted every heated remark. The judge's face was stern, his eyes fixed on both parties as he prepared to restore decorum. Yet, as he spoke, it became evident that he was about to deliver a decision that would shock everyone. After a measured pause, the judge continued, "I will allow both sides a final opportunity to present their arguments, but any further disruption will not be tolerated." His words were not just a warning, they were an announcement of a turning point in the trial. The courtroom's mood shifted once more, this time towards a tense anticipation of what was to come. Cornered and with his defenses crumbling, the defendant gathered every last ounce of resolve for a final plea. Standing before the silent courtroom, he took a deep breath, his voice steadying as he began his defense. "I stand before you not as a criminal, but as a man betrayed by circumstances beyond my control," he declared, his tone earnest and laden with emotion. His eyes, once blazing with anger, now shone with a desperate sincerity. He recounted his version of events, detailing his actions and the miscommunications that had led to this dire situation. Every word was delivered with the weight of regret and hope, appealing directly to the juror's sense of justice. The prosecutor listened intently, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betraying a measure of respect for the defendant's raw honesty. In that moment, the courtroom transformed from a battleground of accusations to a stage for truth. Even the judge, who had maintained his stern facade throughout, seemed momentarily softened by the defendant's impassioned plea. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of tension and the fragile hope that justice might prevail in a fair and balanced manner. After hours of intense argument, the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. The judge, having weighed every piece of evidence and every passionate plea, prepared to deliver his verdict. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, every eye fixed on the judge as he unfolded the final chapter of the trial. Clearing his throat, the judge began, "Having considered all the evidence presented and the testimonies heard, I find that the case is not as clear-cut as previously assumed." His measured tone gave way to a pause that seemed to stretch on forever. The defendant's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing his desperate hope for a second chance. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his otherwise composed features. Then, in a stunning twist that no one had anticipated, the judge declared, "It is with this in mind that I hereby rule in favor of the defendant." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The silence that followed was almost palpable, a mixture of shock, relief, and disbelief. In that charged moment, every life in the room felt the seismic impact of a verdict that would forever change the course of all involved. The shock of the verdict soon gave way to a surge of relief and joy. The defendant, once overwhelmed by the weight of the accusations and the relentless pressure of the trial, now felt a liberating sense of vindication. Slowly, he stood up, his posture no longer tense but imbued with newfound strength. With a faint, grateful smile, he made his way toward the courtroom doors. As he passed by, the prosecutor's expression softened. There was a silent acknowledgement of the injustice that had almost prevailed. Spectators, who had witnessed every turbulent moment, now erupted in quiet cheers and whispers of hope. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the steps of the courthouse in a warm, forgiving light, as if celebrating the triumph of truth over deception. In that final, cathartic moment, the judge offered a nod of solemn approval, signaling that while the path to justice was often fraught with challenges, today, at least, fairness had prevailed. The defendant paused at the threshold, looking back one last time with gratitude in his eyes, before stepping out into a future that promised redemption and renewal.